Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar on evaluating educators. First of all, I want to thank everybody for participating this afternoon, and I want to stop and say thank you, not just for participating this afternoon, but for everything that all our administrators and educators are doing for the students of New Jersey. I say it every time, it is nothing less than miraculous. How you've been able to meet students' needs during this crisis. So congratulations to all of you. With me today, we have Linda Eno, who is the Assistant Commissioner for the Division of Academics and Performance. And we also have David Nash, the Director of Legal One and FEA at FEA. And we have Debbie Bradley, our Director of Government Relations. So let me just tell you a little bit about today's webinar. We are going to stop toward the end to look at questions. So there's a question box that you'll see on your screen that if you, as we go along, want to add questions. I want to thank people who sent in questions previous to the webinar. And so we will cover a lot of those questions toward the end of the presentation. And any questions we don't get to, we'll be working with the department. We'll put together answers to those questions, and we'll get them out as FAQs after the webinar is over. I just want to also take a moment before Linda starts to thank the Department of Education. They have done an outstanding job in trying to monitor everything that's going on with schools across the state, and more importantly, to be supportive of everything that's going on across the state. They truly have been a partner. I can't say enough about the collaboration that has occurred, even on this issue. Linda was sure to bring everybody to the table as we continue to have conversations around this issue. All of the organizations and every stakeholder was involved in those conversations. And so again, I want to thank the department at a time of crisis for keeping that collaboration going. Thank you very much. And with that, I'll turn over to Linda Eno.
Thank you so much, Pat. And thanks to all of you for taking the time to jump in. I know you're busy. This has been, as Pat says, nothing less than heroic. The transitions that you've all made to getting your students an ongoing education in a remote environment. I know that attendance, delivering food, I talk to superintendents, principals, you're out meeting the needs of students. And at the same time, you had the bandwidth to think about your teachers and their needs. And that is critical, because what do they say? If you feed the teachers, they won't eat the children, right? They will continue to do the great work that they've been doing and support them as long as they get the supports that they need. So this is an amended set of guidelines that will be over all of those folks that are covered under Teach NJ, which are our certificated teachers, principals, vice principals, assistant principals, and other certificated staff. So thank you for advancing that. What I need to tell you is that it has been the commissioner's focus of all department flexibilities, guidelines, and amendments to ensure that we optimize flexibility for the context in which you deliver education, while ensuring that we leave a foundational floor of quality. So that was the guiding principle under the executive order that is over all of these changes, and then the guidance that comes out under that. So when assessments were canceled, that triggered a set of realities of downstream changes that needed to be accommodated for. So you will hear some of that, some of what is was statutory that needed to be waived, as well as some of the ways in which we are taking advantage of the flexibilities that the governor afforded the commissioner through his ability to amend regulations in a very expeditious way. So again, this first slide just reiterates what I just said about who does this guidance apply to? And it applies to all teachers, principals, APs, VPs, and other certificated staff, but it's differentiated for several groups of people. It's differentiated for those educators working under a provisional certification, for those educators working towards tenure, and for those educators on a corrective action plan during the 2019-20 school year. And again, the guiding principle is do no harm. We want to make sure that those educators that have opportunities to gain something from receiving a summative score in the 2019-20 year will be allowed to do that. Next. Next. Thank you. So the first flexibility that we afforded applies to tenured teachers in good standing. And in good standing is defined as those educators that had an effective or highly effective rating on their last summative score. So that doesn't necessarily mean last year. If you were out on medical or for another reason and didn't receive a summative score, if you were hired late, this goes back to your last summative score. And as long as that was effective or better, and you are tenured, you for the 2019-20 school year will receive an NE, which is a code meaning not evaluated. You will not need to have those components that come together to comprise a summative rating completed for you. So that's the first thing. And that NE goes in both state and local records. There are two categories of educators, again, that we want to make sure do get a summative score because it gives them the opportunity to move forward in ways that will be beneficial to them. So that's first of all, an educator working under a provisional certification. They are required to receive summative ratings in order to ensure that they advance towards a standard certification. Same thing for a non-tenured educator. A non-tenured educator must receive a summative score for that year to count towards tenure. So those are two groups that I want to talk about first, and then we'll come back to those educators that were operating under a cap for the 2019-20 school year. Go ahead. So this is talking about what an educator on a provisional cert must have. And remember that that's an educator in their first 2 or 3 years of working in a district, and they are working towards a standard certification. So number one, they must receive a summary score based on at least 2 observations that were done prior to the district closing. So the formal closure date for the state for schools was March 18th. Some districts closed ahead of that, and you should use whatever date your district closed on to identify when the observations must have taken place in advance of. So we are not allowing remote observations to count for those teachers and for those educators that must receive a summative rating. And the rationale behind that, I think, is pretty widely agreed on. And it's that we didn't have time to do inter-rater reliability in a remote environment. We didn't have time to build the capacity of our teachers to understand what our expectations were in the remote environment. Everyone's done a fabulous job moving quickly into the remote environment. And I hear nothing but positive in all of the reports that we've gotten, both anecdotal and more formal collection of data, speaks to districts doing a really outstanding job with this. But that doesn't mean that we were prepared to take those experiences and turn them into a score that rates an educator. So 2 observations done prior to the district closing are what the summative score will be based on. There's no use of measures of student learning for this year. Those, again, were waived by executive order, and it's based on 2 things. Number one, there's no MSGP because there is no assessment this year. State assessment's canceled, therefore no MSGP can be generated. Student growth objectives were significantly interrupted where you understood students to be at the beginning of the year and the pace at which you expected them to grow has been completely disrupted by the changes that we've been required to make out here in the field. So the expectation that you could provide a measure of educator effectiveness based on a linear measure of growth was really disrupted and not seen to be a reasonable expectation. So again, 2 observations done before the district closed, no measures of student learning. And we're going to talk a little bit more at the end about what if you didn't have 2 observations on an educator at that point in time when you close. Granted, it should have happened, but in the event that it didn't, we're going to ask you to reach out to the department as we are formalizing some guidance around that. So I'll talk about that at the very end. So we can advance. So very similar for educators that are working towards tenure, with the distinction that you still do 2 observations, still done before the district closed, still no measures of student learning, summary conference, which I didn't mention on the provisional educator side, but for both educators earning a standard cert and those that are moving towards tenure, they need to receive a summary conference. Obviously, that's going to happen in the remote environment unless for some reason things moved very quickly and towards a safe way to do things face-to-face. So that would be a conference conducted remotely, can be a conference call, can be a video conference, whatever your district is currently using. Let's bump forward. Let me just see what's on the next slide. And okay, so we're going to talk about a cap here. I want to just go back 1 slide and talk about what if you didn't have 2 observations, and this will come up as a question, I'm sure, but here's what we're recommending, and we'll get more detail when you call the department or reach out through that email that's tagged there. But I do want to just say that we're recommending a portfolio based on the educator practice rubric that's in use. So please call for details and we will get guidance out quickly. This is not intended to be an exhaustive project for anybody. It's intended to just be a snapshot in a window that you collaboratively designed that took place prior to the district closing and shows artifact support for some of the domains or practice areas that were maybe not shown as well in the first observation. So making sure that you're getting a well-rounded look at the educator through a portfolio as a substitute for that second observation, which may not have gotten done for whatever reason. This is not the time to lament what didn't get done. It's time to be proud of everything that did get done and figure out some solutions to how can we make sure that we don't do any harm to educators that have been working hard this year. So that's the guidance that you'll get from our Office of Professional Learning, and that's Director Tanya Breland and Policy Analyst Pete Mazzagatti, who can support you in really understanding how to build a streamlined, effective portfolio without it being excessively burdensome to either the administrator or the educator that's submitting it. So thank you for letting me go back to that. We'll move forward just to take a quick look at what are we asking educators that were on a corrective action plan to do for this year. So by and large, the advice will be if you were on a corrective action plan, you will receive a not evaluated, an NE, and you will resume that corrective action plan in the fall of the 2021 school year. You'll have a meeting to make sure that the indicators on that plan are reflective of the assignment for the 2021 school year, and you will then move forward with that plan. The option remains for a chief school administrator to make a decision about that educator if the observations that have been done to date indicated that that was an educator that was moving towards an effective or highly effective rating, and hence had the opportunity to come off the corrective action plan, there is the opportunity to move that individual towards a summative rating. Again, based strictly on observations, no measures of student learning, must be a minimum of 2, and that is a decision that we leave to the chief school administrator. So that's the baseline guidance on an educator on a corrective action plan. You may have a question. There are so many unique one-off situations that you should absolutely feel free to reach out to us through this email box and to indicate that you either need a conversation or ask a question, because this guidance is not going to cover all of the unique situations that you're going to have. I know the office has really been working hard to meet the needs of districts, and that we are going to start to pull some districts with like concerns together to have those conversations in a bit of a broader group. And again, as I said, there will be more guidance coming out, but that's the basic framework that we've laid out for the flexibilities that will be afforded around evaluation for the 2019-20 school year. There are a couple of frequently asked questions on here, and I'm going to defer to Pat to see whether you'd like me to walk through these, or whether you want to now take it back and let Dev and David ask a couple of questions that might be more relevant to the audience.
So Linda, why don't you continue to go through what you had anticipated being the most frequently, and then Dave and Debbie can come back and add any other questions that might have come up that we know so far. I know we're getting a lot of questions right now on our question box also. So,
Perfect. So the first one was about required evaluation reporting. So the category of educator that is those operating currently under a provisional certification, the requirement to report to PLMRS exists. So they need a summative score, and they need you to submit through the PLMRS system in order to have this year count towards their standard certification. So that's a really important flag. What you'll have to do for the EIS system, that evaluation information system that you submit to every year, will be provided in guidance as we move towards the end of the year. We felt like getting this initial guidance out was the first and most critical piece, and some clarifying guidance aligned to this is the second piece. And then the final piece will be getting you some more information about the evaluation information system and what you'll need to submit to that. So that's kind of a pin in it and not a complete answer. This question is around, what if you'd already done 3 observations for a teacher in either of those 2 categories, either working under a provisional cert or non-tenured? And the answer is, please go right ahead and use all 3 of those. Multiple measures was always the primary driving theory of action behind Teach NJ and Achieve NJ, and we really want to honor that. We do believe that it's a system that has improved over time. There have been a lot of changes to it, but we still feel like the more holistic picture we have of an educator, the more likely it is to reflect their true efficacy, and to give them the opportunity to show all of the ways in which they are succeeding. So 3 observations, if you have them, please use them. But again, no capturing a measure of educator effectiveness through remote observation. You can advance. Student achievement components will not count for any educator in this year. So SGOs that were already wrapped up, totally appreciate and think that they will continue to contribute to the PLC work and the professional conversations that you're having, but they should not be used in educator evaluation. We need to create a sense of equity across the state, and because we know for many districts they were not wrapped up, and because they were waived by executive order, they should not be used as a measure in the 2019-20 school year. We can add. So those are the three that we had flagged just from the very early conversations. But Pat, why don't I let you tell me what's coming up in the chat box and what we can answer.
Okay, I'm going to ask Deb and Dave Nash to come back. And I know that they have been following the questions and also monitoring the questions that came in from participants before the webinar. So Dave?
So Deb is going to start us off. I'll make one just quick comment because we did get this question from a number of folks. Today's session is being recorded, and we will make it available on our website, and we will also make the PowerPoint available for all participants and kind of affirmatively get that out to all of our participants. So just to make sure folks can rest assured, you will have access to the recording and the PowerPoint. With that, I'll turn it over to Deb.
Okay, I'm going to start, Linda, with what we tried to do was group some of these questions to the situation where, number one, we had employees who were provisional or non-tenured is the situation we're talking out, and their questions related to staff who are required to receive a summative evaluation. So the first question is this: what should be done in the situation where an observation was conducted for a non-tenured teacher and the post-conference was scheduled, but then districts were closed due to the virus and the post-observation conference did not occur during the required timeline due to the statewide closure? Does the observation still count towards the summative evaluation, and should the conference be conducted virtually?
Yeah, so I know Pete Mazzagatti and I talked about this, so this must be coming up in several places. So what we're kind of landing on is if both parties mutually agree to use the observation and conduct the post-conference remotely, even though it's outside of the normal boundaries of time, then go ahead and use it. If not, if one or the other party feels that it just is not an appropriate lapse of time for reflecting and allowing it to be a meaningful post-conference, then I would say let it go. And if you need to engage with us around getting an additional observation in, we can absolutely give you guidance on that.
Okay, and I know you just talked about the situation where a district may have already completed 3 observations before schools closed in March for a staff member. But in that circumstance, you're encouraging districts to use all 3 observations for that teacher or administrator. Does that practice have to be consistent across the district? So in some cases, you may have completed all 3 for one teacher, but you may not have done that for another. Does it have to be consistent across the district?
It has to be consistent in that for every teacher that you completed 3 observations on, you use all 3. It does not need to be consistent that you would have completed all 3. The guidance is baseline is 2. And if you completed 3, use all 3. So there may be some consistent inconsistencies within a district.
Okay. The next question. This is kind of a more specific one, but I'll try to generalize it a little bit. This district is talking about they use domain 4 of their teacher evaluation is done as part of the 3rd observation for their non-tenured staff. And in their district, it counts for a certain percentage of the total score of a teacher. So they're saying some of their non-tenured teachers had all 3 observations completed before school closed, and therefore they had this domain completed. For the non-tenured staff that will now be scored on 2 observations because the 3rd was not yet done, Can they score domain 4 separately with each teacher remotely, assuming it is based on professional development and other professional responsibilities that were completed prior to March 2020, when schools were closed, so that all teachers in their district will then be evaluated on domain 4 in their rubric? Or is that considered to be evaluating teachers after school closed?
Yeah, I would say that anything that was not done when school closed should not be done now. I just think that what we're trying to do is create a consistent workload for people, consistent profile of expectations. We know that educators right now are also homeschooling, they're caring for extended family, they're just operating in ways that are unique in so many ways that they are more burdensome, right? When things are new, they take more time. It is not as smooth. And so the additional stressors that are on people are our primary concern. And we're just very interested in trying to minimize the ways in which we ask people to do more. So if it was not done, not scored in advance, then our advice is to just go with the minimum that's being asked for.
Okay. What will be the process that you will follow at the department in working with districts where a teacher doesn't have the required number of observations?
Right. So if a teacher needs one more, an educator needs one more observation, we will, again, right now, verbally give, and I've seen a first draft of some guidance that will come out around how to create a portfolio within a window of time that took place prior to school closing and focuses on domains that still need to be represented in order to come to a summative score for that educator. So portfolios are something that we're quite familiar with. We've drafted guidance around that through NJ People, which is our principal practice instrument, as well as around highly effective educators for teachers. So it's not a new approach for us. We will really tailor it for the circumstances here, which will be to say, keep it manageable, keep it really focused on what an administrator needs to see in order to best understand the effectiveness of a teacher during a certain window, and the artifact should really highlight those domains or those areas that of professional practice that weren't well shown in the other observation. If an educator had no observations done to date, then the year is going to be forfeit.
Okay, that's the group of my first group of questions. So I'll hand it over to Dave.
Sure. So just to clarify, the last point that you made, Linda, you indicated that if the person had no observations at all, the year would be forfeited. So how do we handle that if somebody needs to have a final summative score and they're non-tenured, either an administrator or teacher? And this could happen more likely with an administrator, and that person hasn't received any evaluations at all. Linda, you seem to have frozen.
Let's see if I'm back now.
Now you're back.
Yep, sorry, my VPN expired while I was talking.
Okay.
So I'm sorry, David, I was focusing on snagging my VPN number.
Sure.
So the question was about those educators that had received no observations to date.
Yes, so if somebody has no observations, this could happen with a teacher, it could more likely happen with an administrator, and it's a non-tenured person who still needs a summative score.
Right. So what I'm saying is that I see that as a year that is not going to be able to be scored, but why don't we just leave it at reach out to us. Let's see what's the extent of people that are in this situation and what the appetite is for coming up with alternative guidance around this. What I don't want to do is I don't want to hurt people who were in the pipeline for either advancing for tenure or moving towards a standard cert. And there may be reasons that were outside of their control that no observations were done. So I think that we should ask to hear from people that are in this situation so that we don't write off the opportunity to advance towards something that has substantive value to people without considering it.
I think that's very helpful. So let me ask a couple of variations on issues that could come up with someone on a corrective action plan. And there are all sorts of unique situations here. In most cases, if somebody is receiving a not evaluated rating, that means they're in good standing. But if you have somebody on a corrective action plan, if they're receiving that not evaluated, that indicates that they were not making the progress we wanted on that corrective action plan.
Correct.
So just one example would be somebody who was rated partially effective in 2018-19 receives and then are on a corrective action plan. That person receives a not evaluated for 2019-20, and let's say that person is rated partially effective next year in 2020-21. Would that now trigger the automatic filing of tenure charges because the NE rating is the functional equivalent of partially effective? Would it prohibit tenure charges because we can't consider the NA to be the same as partially
so
effective?
it would be if a person receives an NE and it was a year that they were on a corrective action plan, it will be a year that does not count within their clock ticking, right? And it's because we've pulled out measures that might well have benefited them in terms of their overall rating. Their SGOs, their MSGP may have been enough to have pulled them into an effective rating. And without those measures and without our ability to use all of the pieces that are normally contributing to a summative score, to hold somebody liable for that year is just it's a very tough call to make. So again, basic premise: do no harm, and the idea is then it's going to be dependent on local reporting and local records for a school district to ensure that that corrective action plan is picked up again, and that it's tailored to the assignment for the 2021 school year, and that conversation moves forward.
So for the purpose of potential tenure charges, would we then be considering that year as if it didn't exist, and you would look at 18-19 and then 20-21 for potentially triggering tenure charges?
Yeah, so that's the way that we've been talking about it, David, but there may be something legal here that you're thinking about that I'm not, or a nuance that needs to be worked through. So maybe that's something that we should offline about and make sure that we have clear legal guidance around that. Because this is really meant to be practice guidance, not legal guidance. And I would not like to go on the record as providing legal guidance here, but rather to defer that legal piece to an additional conversation where we can have a few more folks at the table and hammer that out and put it out in clearer guidance. Does that sound fair?
Yeah, that's very helpful. I think they're complicated questions, and there are all sorts of triggers linked to mandatory or discretionary tenure charges. that come with folks on corrective action plans. So I
Yeah.
think it would be really useful to have a follow-up
Good,
conversation.
so why don't you and I connect offline, David, and we'll make sure that that conversation happens and we get the right people at the table and advance that so that it can go out in clear guidance.
That's great. All right, so let me turn back to Deb at this point.
Okay, looking at what's coming in, one of the recurring questions is whether or not there's going to be any guidance on what the portfolio will look like or what would be acceptable examples for a portfolio.
Yeah, there absolutely will be. And so I've seen a first draft of it. And so we all have to do some back and forth and then send it up through our internal channels. So in the meantime, we'll continue to provide you with some email support and guidance through both Tanya Breland and Pete Mazzagatti, but then we will take the time to get that guidance into approved DOE format and get it out to you.
Okay, next I'm going to group a bunch of questions that deal with tenured staff members who are in good standing.
Mm-hmm.
The first deals with if there is a tenured teacher who was previously effective or highly effective, but they were on an approved leave like maternity leave for all of the 2018-19 year, so they were not evaluated. Should they be considered to be in good standing in this current academic year and receive an NE rating while they were on leave?
The district should just go back to their last summative rating. So that would be the 17-18 school year.
Okay. Okay.
And as long as that was an effective or highly effective, that educator should receive an NE.
Okay. The next question is, what happens if for these folks who were highly effective or effective, and the district had already completed all their observations so that they could actually give a summative rating? Do they give the NE or give the summative rating?
Right, they should give the NE and use the observations as coaching conversations, opportunities to highlight areas of big success. I think these are always valuable conversation starters, opportunities to indicate where there's potential for growth and where there's potential to leverage some really good best practices and areas of strength. So these kinds of I don't know, chances to see instruction in action and the subsequent write-up and conversations that come out of those are never wasted, but they won't be used this year for producing a summative score.
Okay. I know in our conversations with you, one of the things we were all trying to achieve was to make sure that this year's process didn't do any harm to an educator's rating, but also to recognize the change in administrative capacity based upon this current state of emergency. So I guess there are a lot of questions focused on what is really the department expecting in terms of a write-up for an evaluation of a teacher who's effective or highly effective. If we're categorizing them or rating them as NE for this year, is there any write-up or documentation logs or specific reports expected for that, or do we just have supervisors putting in the NE term in their file?
Right, so two different things. What do you need locally to feel like you've had enough of an instructional conversation with your staff, right? Whether that's your principals, your vice principals, or your teachers. Everybody deserves conversations about their professional practice and how they are engaging in the work that they do and how they've engaged in it over the course of the year. But the department never collects your observation write-ups. We never collect your summative write-ups. We collect just your summative scores and your component scores so that we can have some sense of how our educators across the state are doing and growing. But our need to have a write-up from you, we don't have a need for that. But you do have an obligation as a professional learning community to engage with your staff, and whatever that looks like and whatever role the observations that have been done for your effective and highly effective teachers is really a conversation that should be taking place internally and you can make decisions on. That's different than what we'll need for reporting. So the EIS system is the system in which we put data related to the evaluation system as required under Teach NJ, and those guidance points will be coming out. So keep your local records, and then we'll give you guidance on how that gets processed. And don't forget, for your teachers on a provisional cert, to use PLMRS.
Okay.
Did that answer that question?
I think
Deb?
so. I think the question is what will the state be looking for in terms of monitoring also? I think some members have been hearing
For
from
CUSAC?
the superintendents for CUSAC purposes. What kind of documentation will you be looking for this year?
Right. So we haven't had that detailed conversation about CUSAC, but we will not ask for more than we have described to you that you are responsible for in guidance. So we've told you that you are not responsible for completing the components that lead to a summative score for tenured teachers in good standing, that you do need to have a minimum of 2 observations and produce a summative score based on those for provisional and non-tenured. So that's the guidance, and that's what you won't be held accountable for anything that's beyond that.
Great. And I have one last one in this area, which is if a district has opted to use the portfolio evaluation process for teachers who were rated as highly effective in the 2018-19 year, may the district continue to allow the portfolio option for that teacher in 2020-2021, even
Yes.
though the teacher received an NE rating this year?
Yes, you can go right back to your last summative rating and apply that. That's a great question.
Great. Thank you. Back to Dave.
Okay, so we appreciate your willingness to answer all these questions. A couple of others for you. For folks who are non-certificated staff, our aides, secretaries, custodial, maintenance, food service, is there any guidance that you're putting out there for how we should think about observation and evaluation for those individuals?
Right, so they don't fall under Achieve NJ or Teach NJ. So you're talking about your non-certificated, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, so they don't fall under this guidance. So whatever your local prevailing policy is, you should look at and amend as needed. I mean, this is going to be the guidance for everything. Districts need to be looking at local policy and determining what is reasonable and meets the needs of these times, right? So I think the question is, what is it that you need people to understand from wrapping up evaluations of non-certificated staff? What's the benefit to them? What's the benefit to the administration? And then make sure that you have policy umbrella that covers you for the decisions that you make. And I would also add, just be clear with people. The executive order waived the initial date of October 31st by which superintendents need to notify staff of the process by which they will be evaluated so that things could change. And then we've put some guidance out there, which clearly does not cover everybody in your district. So as you make decisions about what to do with your non-certificated staff, just make sure you're clear with people, fair and clear.
Good. We have another question for regarding professional development requirements. As you know, it's a very challenging time right now, and we have a whole slew of mandated professional development that could be challenging to comply with by the end of the school year. Do school districts still need to meet all the statutory professional development requirements by the end of the school year?
Yeah, so I'm most familiar with with districts getting those things out of the way in the beginning of the year. So if there are school districts that haven't done that, they should reach out to us, and so we can have a conversation and get some sense of who may be struggling to complete those statutory requirements. Those are things like your suicide trainings that occur annually and so forth. So let's start with that, David, and maybe we can add that to our list of legal conversations that we should be having, so that when we get together, we tackle that one as well.
Absolutely. Related question, of course, we have to put in place professional development plans, the PDPs for individuals. Any thoughts about how districts should be approaching the development of PDPs?
Yeah, so remember, those aren't due until October 31st. So you have a fairly long window. And I think that having conversations about them now in whatever team meetings districts are continuing to have, and just thinking about what you can imagine being useful, what a district can imagine being useful for different groups of educators as you move into fall 2020. I think that is, it's a real opportunity, but it's also going to be a challenge, right? We don't quite know yet what fall 2020 will look like. And so I don't think anybody's going to be able to wrap this conversation up in advance or right now. But I do think you can start having conversations. What's working well in the remote environment, what supports are needed, what will be needed by students and teachers as we return from what's been a very stressful time. I think there's a lot of opportunity to think about what team building looks like, what social and emotional supports and learning look like, both for our educators and our students. So I think there's some real opportunities in here, but I think they're really different opportunities than we would have been thinking about, or at least maybe in different priority order than we might have been thinking about them last fall. So I think lots of opportunity for some really good conversations. But you do have some time.
Thank you. One more, and I'll turn it back to Deb. Looking at some of the questions coming in, if we have somebody who started mid-year, hired by the district, would that guidance still pertain that if there were not 2 observations, the district should contact the Department of Education? Person starts, January as opposed to September. Would 1 observation be here?
So that's a great question, and I don't think I have an automatic answer for that, because there is a time frame within which a tenured teacher goes down to 2 which a non-tenured goes down to 2 observations, and I don't remember exactly what that time frame is. So why don't we put that in the bucket of reach out to us via EdEval, and we'll make sure the team talks about this and gets back to you on what is the percent of the year. So if somebody came in January and was there operating in the in-person environment for 2.5 or 3.5 months, what's the expectation?
Great. Deb, other questions you want to raise from our list?
Yes, Linda, some of the members are asking what the timelines are for non-tenured summatives, and when should these summatives be completed this year?
Right, so I think the timeline that doesn't change is that a non-tenured that is going to be non-renewed needs to be notified by May 15th, unless you are an April voting district, in which case the timeline's been extended to June 5th. It's not required that evaluations be done prior to notifying. I think April 30th rings a bell for me as a deadline. And I think as close to that as people can come. Don't drag it on for people. Try to get these things done, but that is not something that we have. I don't think that deadline was waived. So I'm not coming up with a really clear answer on this one. David, do you remember whether that was in the executive order? The waiver of that April 30th
no.
deadline?
April 30th was not waived.
Right.
Same.
Right. So just try to get people done. If you are struggling with that, let them know, let us know. But I think that's the best I've got for you. It's not a lot of time to wrap things up, but hopefully people are pretty well on their way. And if you are working to get portfolios cleared up, let's talk about what you need for time and make sure that you and the individual that's being evaluated are on the same page.
Mhm.
Just to reiterate, Linda, I know you did mention this, but we did get the question a couple of times. We are not using SGOs this year as part of the evaluation process.
Correct. We are not using any measure of student learning. It's strictly based on the 2 observations and in some cases 3.
So I'm going to jump in because Linda, I want to thank you so much because there are a ton of questions. But just so everybody in the audience knows, that's one of the reasons too why we wanted to do this webinar. We realized that the department has been reacting to the needs of all the educators and trying to weave through some complicated policies and everything around that. And as I said, has brought everybody to the table to have these discussions. Is, as you heard Linda, you know, when they don't have a clear answer, the intention is to get the clear answer. So we're going to use your questions and continue to work with the department to come up with the best answers. And if you should have other questions, I'm going to urge you to continue to send them to NJPSA so that we can help you to get the right information. I'm sure the department will be inundated with a lot of questions. So if we can help by playing an intermediary there, we certainly will. But I just can't say enough. Everybody's intentions, I think, with this are so positive in trying to cut down the amount of work that has to be done. Keep in mind, these are not voluminous. I heard that loud and clear. Portfolios, these are very targeted pieces, and you know, it's not like we want anybody going back into the schools to get artifacts at the
Great point.
Right. So that's certainly not the issue. I think that the purpose is to try to make this as easy yet as fair as possible in the end. So I want to thank Linda very much for being here. I thank Debbie and Dave for following up on these questions, and I urge you all to continue to send your questions to us at NJPSA so that we can get you the answers you need in the time that you need it, hopefully. So again, congratulations to all of you out there who are doing such a good job. And our thoughts and our prayers and everything are always with you out in the field. And just know that NJPSA continues to be here to support you in whatever you need. And we will continue to run these free webinars to get you the latest information as we move ahead. So thank you all again for attending this afternoon. Have a good day.
Thank you very much for hosting. All the best.